Our next speakers is a co-presentation by Chris from physIQ and Bert Hartog from Janssen, who are going to speak to us about the personalized biosensor-enabled safety monitoring and then digital biomarkers in oncology treatment. Chris.
Thank you. So my name is Chris Economos. It is a real privilege to be here today with Bert from Janssen to talk about continuous data collection and digital biomarkers, not only in the context of a clinical trial, but also how this can be used for actual patient care. So at physIQ, we're an analytics company, but we specialize and focus specifically and exclusively on physiology analytics. So our thesis is a business that there's an evolving set of wearable biosensors out there, and we are the intelligence layer that sits on top of that ecosystem of sensors to take the data and turn it into insight. We actually focus our solution on two different markets within healthcare. One is clinical trials, the types of things that we're talking about today, but also we focus on healthcare delivery, where we actually provide our solution and our tools to healthcare professionals, payers, and health systems to better manage their at-risk patient populations. And in some cases, such as what we're going to talk about today, those two intersect. So as a company, we really focus on analytics, but we've also developed a platform. Of course, if you're going to analyze data, you've got to be able to get that data. Again, we focus on data from wearable biosensors, so we have a device-agnostic, cloud-based mobile platform designed to take data via Bluetooth, send it to the cloud for analysis, where we then take the data and turn it into insight. Now, again, this solution is really geared towards a clinician being able to look at these data in near real time to make clinical decisions in terms of how they want to treat those patients. And our user interface reflects that. But what's interesting is part of our analytics, we have the ability to detect anomalies, physiological anomalies at a personalized level that from a clinical trial perspective allow us to automatically then push certain ePro questionnaires to patients to align the subjective symptomatic data with the objective physiological data, and all of it overlaid within the user interface and then available to researchers as they want to develop their own biomarkers. So at the core of our company, again, we're an analytics company. We have our proprietary 510(k) cleared personalized physiology analytics. So this is a machine learning, AI-based approach to taking a multivariate data set from a wearable biosensor to build a individualized mathematical model of that patient's cardiopulmonary physiology such that we can detect change. So the way that this works is that, again, real time, the system is capturing multivariate data set from a biosensor. So continuous heart rate, continuous respiration rate, continuous activity as an example. We have a system then that learns that data. It learns the relationship between those parameters across about a 48-hour baseline training period. Now that training is variable depending on the fidelity of the model that we want to establish. But coming out of that model, the system establishes a personal dynamic baseline across the different parameters. So looking at what is heart rate, respiration rate, activity, et cetera, as a combined system across all the activities that you'd expect from a patient in the real world. And then the system transitions from learning mode into monitoring mode, where it looks at the new data coming in to detect subtle changes, seen here as a residual. So in that context, we're not really focused on the absolute value of a vital sign, but rather the difference between what's expected and what's actual. And in terms of giving this as a tool to clinicians who want to manage and monitor a large population of at-risk patients, we roll this up into an FDA-cleared index of physiological change. So change that indicates for that individual from baseline the type of underlying physiological change that may manifest from disease progression, deterioration, improvement, or medication change. An example of that is here. So this is one patient out of our heart failure study that was sponsored by the U.S. Veterans Administration. So this is a 100-patient observational study that we did to validate our analytics ability to detect and predict heart failure exacerbation. And so what we've got here on the x-axis is a timeline. This is a heart failure patient who was discharged from the hospital, provided with wearable biosensors, provided with a phone to transmit the data. And you see now a plot, continuous plot of their heart rate, respiration rate, and activity. So the first 48 hours of that data, the system's learning what that individual's physiology looks like. and then establishes a baseline seen here. So the next 5 days after discharge, this patient's physiology is behaving as the system expects it. You see very close overlap between the orange machine learning generated estimates and the blue actual data. But then we begin to see divergence between the model and the actual data, indicating that this person's cardiopulmonary physiology has changed. The compensatory mechanism within their cardiopulmonary control loop has started to kick in because this patient's getting sicker. Now, that patient was then hospitalized, and you can see the intervention date, and then this patient continued to wear the biosensor post-hospitalization, or actually I should say through their hospitalization, and you can see how they return back to their baseline. And again, this is all rolled up to an index of change where you see greater and greater index leading up to that hospitalization and then returning back to their baseline upon or as they approach their hospital discharge. So that's really talking about this in the context of actual clinical care, where this is now a tool being used by clinicians to predict heart failure events or COPD exacerbation so they can get ahead of these events with their patients. But we also apply this in a clinical trial capacity. An example of a clinical trial that we're currently engaged in, 600 patients across 97 different sites in 15 different countries now, where we've translated our app into 10 different languages. The objectives here are to baseline a patient prior to the intervention such that we can detect these meaningful physiological changes. And the operating model is probably as you'd expect. Patients get the biosensor prior to the intervention, and then they are provided with subsequent disposable biosensors over the course of the next 12 months. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bert to talk about how we're applying this in oncology.
Thank you. So a little bit more background to provide some context on the use case I will introduce and how Chris and I met to actually start doing some work together. So my world is clinical trials, and the portfolio that my company is working on is about 400 trials every year. There's about 100, 150 that start, a similar number that closes every year, so there's turnover, but the portfolio is rather large. And the number of sites is in the 16,000, and the number of patients is in the 100,000. The reason these numbers are important is when you start collecting data, digital data from these patients, you've got huge variety. And there's the discussion about standards and the discussion about variability in devices and what have you. But there's also simple logistic questions like how do you provide support? How do you prevent these 100,000 patients to contact their site to ask for help because the app doesn't download? These sites will go crazy and they will not want to work with you in the future. So there are other things that come with running the digital biomarkers in clinical trials that warrant attention. My job is really to look at the clinical trial of the future and to enable the organization to run those trials. So that includes digital biomarkers, it includes remote patient monitoring, it includes mining EHR data, and it's really about understanding how to make use of this in the context of that trial portfolio. So one use case we came across originated in one of these trials. And this one is to do with acute myeloid leukemia, so a blood cancer that is very aggressive. Patients present themselves typically with infections because of their immune system not really working the way it's supposed to do. And patients suffer from infusion reactions, which is like an adverse reaction to some of the drugs that are being prescribed. That necessitates very rigid safety monitoring, and that got us thinking. So when we looked at different subpopulations in that group of patients, we identified 3 different types where chemotherapy provided in hospital is accompanied with patients being discharged and instructions to contact the hospital when they feel ill, typically because of infections occurring. The patients receiving transfusions typically are sent home and contact the hospital when they feel tired, which will be the indication for the next transfusion. And then there will be blood chemistry tests to make sure the transfusion is done at the right time, not too early, not too late. But the feeling, the fatigue, the tiredness is the indication. And then with these newer treatments with monoclonal antibodies, there's a significant risk of infusion reactions at the onset of treatment. It's very hard to predict, but it's very common, and it's therefore that these treatments come with safety protocols, very rigid safety protocols that dictate what safety measures need to be taken. Every 10 minutes you take vitals. If it's good, you extend to 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour intervals, and you may change the dose the administration of the dose based on your vitals. So if the vitals are good, you can increase the dose. If the vitals are not so good, you decrease the dose. And if there's a need for intervention, you may stop the treatment altogether. So a lot of safety reporting taking place there. Question we asked is, what can technology do to bring benefits to these patients in this clinical setting, which is what we found in a clinical trial setting, so even more specific. And how we came to physIQ is that we found a multi-sensor patch that collects all these vitals, where the data is analyzed on the physIQ platform. And that's where the change started. And we started thinking, how can we do this safety monitoring different? How can we give the data to the physician without depending on people generating the data? How can we make the data available anytime, any place? So they're not dependent on access to the electronic health record, but they can just see the data on any screen, ideally combined with alerts based on thresholds, so they only look at the data when it's necessary. And they don't have to look for alerts, but they will receive alerts. So a push system rather than a pull system. And then we thought about the nurses doing the work and taking the assessments, where these safety protocols I described are really tying nurses to the place where the patient is. They have to be there every 10 minutes, every 15, every 30. So that disrupts their routine. Nurses are super busy, and if they have to be in a certain place at a certain time, that prevents them from being somewhere else. Pretty obvious when you think about it, but when you reverse it, and when you use these sensors to generate the data, the nurse can see it, doesn't have to be with the patient at these prescribed intervals, so that could free up, liberate the nurses. Same for patients. They won't have to be in the room where the assessment is taking place. They can wander around in the hospital when they're in the hospital, and at home they can take comfort from being monitored. So it truly liberates the patient. So that's where I'll give it back to Chris to talk about how we made this happen.
So again, exciting implementation. This is occurring at Haga Hospital in the Netherlands, one of the largest hospitals in the Netherlands. And they had a challenge with respect to, we've got these powerful and effective therapies, but as Bert indicated, they often are associated with adverse events that, if appropriately monitored, can be minimized and addressed. And so what we've done is to deploy our system with the clinicians there at the Haga Hospital, where we have sent them kits that include the biosensor patch, phones, that they then provide to the patients to wear, both in advance of treatment and then during treatment. So the way that this works, a patient is scheduled for an infusion. They are provided with the kit about a week in advance. The first patch of data, the first 5 days of data, streams continuously to our platform, where the system then is applying the machine learning analytics I described earlier to build a baseline for those patients. So this is pre-therapy, right? It's learning that patient as they are before they've had a therapy introduced. And then they're monitored during the treatment itself in the clinic, and then they also go home where more patches for the next 2 weeks, and those alerts and indications are sent directly to those clinicians so they can keep an eye on those patients when they're outside of the hospital environment. And of course, those data are also then provided to Janssen so they can do their initial retrospective analysis. So this is what our user interface looks like. This is actually what the clinicians there at the Haga Hospital are seeing. So you see continuous streaming data. Our analytics are applied to those data. And then in addition to the objective physiological signals, the system is also generating the ePro data. And so there's 2 types of questions that we've included into that app. The first question is an indicator for the clinician to mark the beginning of the infusion and the end of the infusion, so we can actually timestamp when the therapy was introduced and when it stopped within the context of the system and the physiological data that's being captured. But then it's also generating ePro questions for the patients that they're answering on a daily basis and largely related to symptoms. All of this is in Dutch right here, so I can't tell you exactly what those are, but suffice it to say, we're getting a read on how those patients are doing when they're at home after the infusion.
So where do we see this go? This use case really serves a much bigger context, as I introduced. We see this body area network, the data generated directly of patients, integrating with connected healthcare. That doesn't mean that the patient data will go into the electronic health records and that's where it's all going to reside. It's going to go in the cloud and it's going to be made available for research and personalized analytics. But the two will start meeting. We also see opportunity for new business models. This remote patient monitoring model doesn't have to be monitored by the treating physician. This could be centralized. This could be regional, could be national even. You can think of service models where somebody takes care of the monitoring, the alert is going to the treating physician or whomever is in contact with the patient. It doesn't have to be a burden on site. So when you extrapolate that thinking, you can start shifting some activities from the hospital, routine activities from the hospital, into centralized service models where the hospital will be left providing the expertise and the specialty services to patients. So a different way to introduce efficiencies into healthcare. We see this type of approach as a fundamental component to be able to run decentralized clinical trials, where you run your trials outside the clinic, away from this hospital-based, visit-based clinical trial that we've seen for the past 25 years, into one where you may need only one clinic, who is the central coordinating clinic, and then every activity takes place at home or in community clinics, where patients are much more able to continue to live their life, and the data you generate is much more reflective of real world and much less of a burden to the patients. Then we see this personal data cloud concept, and when you look at the announcements from Apple to allow patients to carry their own healthcare data, that is an indication that that's the world we're moving into. Patients will be able to present themselves with their personal data cloud, which will probably sit somewhere in a cloud managed by a service provider. Definitely not in the electronic health record and all the limitations that brings. The electronic health record will feed into that same cloud. The patient will have control, and then the patient can present him or herself with a completely different starting point than they present with today. And finally, and that's where it gets really exciting, we think we'll be able to use these signatures to really differentiate product or treatments based on individual characteristics. And when you think about that in the context of clinical research, that is a complete shift away from these very homogenized clinical trials where everybody is considered to be exactly the same and you're looking for your statistical power, into effectively a model where every individual is the one entity you want to have the data on to see if that treatment is right for that individual, and then you can start pooling and take it from there. But you reverse it, you start from the individual to go up into population level rather than the other way around. So I think that is really where patients will ultimately benefit most, and it will be enabled by all these movements and developments, and hopefully it's going to be sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bert. Chris, thank you. A little applause, please. I think we have time for one or two questions before we go into the coffee break. Yes, Keith.
Yeah, maybe it's a very dumb question, but since it's safety monitoring, if something needs to be done, can the patient do that themselves if they're not the hospital? I mean, how are the events handled?
So the system is really designed for the clinician to read and evaluate the data. We don't make much available to the patients themselves by design right now. That's on our roadmap, but we're working with really sophisticated multivariate data sets, and they don't lend themselves very well to patient interpretation. Now, our index of change is different. It does allow for patients to see a distilled down indication of a physiological anomaly, but per our FDA clearance and the roadmap, our regulatory roadmap with FDA, we are focusing that insight on the clinician and not yet on the patient, but we are going in that direction.
Very good. May I allow just one follow-up question from my side? So kind of then the burden is on the physician. How do you ensure that the physician takes in the right time frame the right action to save the patient, essentially?
Well, so and I like your perspective on this as well. A lot of the things that we're looking at are not necessarily spontaneous events. And so the system is available such that patients or clinicians can see the data whenever, and the events whenever within the system. But we've also implemented, not in this particular study, but in others, where an actual event alert will go to that clinician's phone, where they'd be able to see it in near real time.
Okay, very good.
And that's exactly the way to go, where you want to tap the 24/7 service availability that every hospital has got. where it may not be the physician, it may be whoever is on duty at that time that receives the incoming call. But when you think about it, that's really the starting point for this centralized monitoring service, where you don't want to be dependent on somebody somewhere in a hospital. You want a reliable, trustworthy service that will take care of the triaging of information to the right people.
Philip?
Follow-up question on that, because we have been thinking about that also. So devices can detect falls, seizure, or big problems. If you have a stream of data, that means that you see it. You are probably liable for it. So specifically in the US, did you think about how to escape any lawsuits or whatever around that? Because it's going to be a question.
So that's a question we get quite a bit. And it actually happens a lot of times when we sell to the payer environment and health systems. And it's unclear how that's going to shake out. But I can say, thankfully, that has yet to preclude anybody from doing this, right? I think all the clinicians that we talk to say, yes, you know, there is stuff there that we might end up seeing, but the risk of that does not outweigh the benefit of being able to proactively take care of these patients. You're going to have some institutions that are more risk averse, but thankfully that hasn't been the issue for us yet.
And specific in the clinical trial setting, it's all about informed consent and making it absolutely crystal clear to patients what they can expect. It's no different from sequencing, where you don't tell patients everything you find. Maybe because you're not sure, maybe because it's not relevant, maybe because it's not really appropriate. But you tell them up front, here's what we're going to collect, here's what we're going to do with it, here's what you're signing up for. Same here.
Thank you so much. I think we need to stop it here and defer other questions to the coffee break. I think really spearheading presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.